Forget everything you think you know about the pimps of the old world, the supposed puppet masters of the 19th century underworld. Erase the image from your mind of a man draped in velvet and diamonds, a charismatic emperor of vice ruling a loyal stable of breathtaking courtesans. That character, the slick, untouchable kingpin, swimming in stacks of cash earned from easily managed flesh, is a ghost. He's a fantasy cooked up a century later by Hollywood scriptwriters who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the filth he supposedly ruled. The reality, as it so often is, was far less glamorous and infinitely more disgusting. The average pimp of the 1800s wasn't a mastermind of a criminal empire. He was a glorified zookeeper for humans, and his life was a miserable cocktail of cheap whiskey, bone-deep paranoia, and a constant suffocating proximity to other people's bodily fluids. He wasn't a predator at the top of the food chain, he was a parasite, clinging desperately to a host body that was itself sick and dying, all while trying to fight off other, bigger parasites. His throne wasn't made of gold, it was a rickety, beer-stained chair in the corner of a saloon, and his crown was a cheap derby hat, probably crawling with lice. He was a man whose entire existence was a performance of power he didn't have, a frantic dance to stay one step ahead of the clap, the constable, and the crushing, pathetic reality of his own insignificance. This isn't a story about power, it's a story about the illusion of power and the grimy, desperate, and frankly pathetic reality of the men who chased it. It's about the sweat, the shame, and the syphilitic terror that defined the life of history's most overrated villain. But before we get into the grimy business of managing flesh, I need a roll call from my board of directors. Report your location and the local time in the comments. I want to know what gilded cage or grimy basement you're tuning in from. Ready to see how the sausage gets made and then gets spoiled? Good. Let's talk business. Let's be brutally honest about the daily routine of our so-called macaroni, our would-be gentleman of leisure. His pre-ritual preparations didn't involve polishing a silver-headed cane or selecting a fine silk waistcoat. It began, almost universally, with the jarring horror of waking up. Not in a plush four-poster bed, but on a lumpy mattress in a flophouse, the air thick with the smell of stale bodies and regret. The first sensation of the day wasn't the kiss of a devoted lover, but the agonizing throb of a hangover, a constant companion fueled by the cheap, watered-down rotgut that was both his primary business expense and his only real friend. His first act of management wasn't to review financial ledgers, it was to perform the morning inspection, a ritual of humiliation and control that set the tone for the entire miserable day. Imagine him, stinking of last night's booze and his own unwashed sweat, lurching into the cramped, airless room where his investments slept. He wasn't looking for beauty or signs of restfulness. He was a frantic auditor of human decay. His eyes would scan not for alluring curves, but for the telltale signs of last night's violence. A new bruise on a cheek, that was bad for business, a sign of a client getting out of hand, or worse, a mark of his own drunken temper that would now cost him money. A split lip, that meant she couldn't work a rich client who minded a bit of blood in his kiss. His gaze was a cold, calculating instrument of profit and loss, measuring flesh in terms of its immediate marketability. Was she coughing too much? That dreaded, rattling cough of consumption was a death knell for his income stream. He'd press a hand to her forehead, not with concern, but to check for the fever that signaled the onset of something that could wipe out his entire, pathetic operation. This wasn't paternalism, it was animal husbandry. He was checking his livestock for rot, for any imperfection that would lower its value at market. Then came the search for stolen coin. His hands, greasy and rough, would pat down the thin mattress, search under the lumpy pillow, even sometimes force a humiliating search of the woman's own meager belongings. Every missing penny was a personal insult, a sign that his control was slipping, a crack in the fragile facade of his authority. The paranoia was a constant, gnawing acid in his gut. He trusted no one, least of all the women whose bodies paid for his existence. After the inspection came his own pathetic attempt at grooming, a desperate effort to project an image of prosperity that was a laughable lie. He wouldn't be bathing in a porcelain tub. He'd be lucky to have a basin of cold, murky water to splash on his face. He might run a filthy comb through hair greased with cheap bear fat, the smell of rancid grease mingling with the stench of whiskey. He'd carefully button a shirt that was on its third or fourth day of wear, perhaps turning the collar to hide the grime. Every gesture was part of the performance. He had to look like a man in charge, a man of means, a protector, even as his stomach churned with fear and his pockets were empty, save for a few sticky, ill-gotten coins. The final stage of this morning ritual was the pep talk, a grotesque perversion of motivation. It was never about encouragement. It was a carefully calibrated speech of threats, lies, and manipulation. He'd remind them of the debts they owed him for the squalid roof over their heads, for the rancid food he provided, for the protection he offered from the other predators circling outside. These debts were, of course, a fantasy, an inescapable financial prison designed to ensure they could never leave. He'd dangle the illusion of a better future, a vague promise that if they worked hard enough, they could one day buy their freedom, a lie so thin it was transparent to everyone in the room. And woven throughout it all was the threat of violence, sometimes veiled, sometimes brutally explicit. A tightening of his grip on an arm, a cold stare, a casual mention of what happened to the last girl who got lazy. This wasn't business preparation. It was the daily reinforcement of a cage, a grim, repetitive process of ensuring his prisoners remained too broken, too scared, and too poor to even dream of escape. His day didn't begin with ambition. It began with the shoring up of his own desperate, fragile control over a world that could, and often did, crumble into violence and disease at a moment's notice. The fancy pimp of legend was a fiction. The reality was a man who started every day terrified, and his first job was to transfer that terror onto someone even more helpless than himself. Sound romantic? It wasn't. Now let's talk about the stage for this grim theatre of commerce. The environment, the so-called brothel or crib, was not the opulent, velvet-draped pleasure palace of cinematic fantasy. It was a character in itself, an active participant in the degradation, and a perfect reflection of the pimp's true station in life: cheap, rotten, and disposable. Forget gilded mirrors and plush chaise lounges. Picture a crib, which was often little more than a windowless shack or a single subdivided room in a tenement, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, located in the most wretched part of town. The walls were thin, flimsy partitions of rough-hewn wood, offering zero privacy. Every grunt, every sob, every argument, every ragged cough from the neighboring cribs bled through, creating a constant, suffocating symphony of human misery. There was no soundproofing, only the shared acoustics of despair. The very architecture was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum humanity. A row of these cribs, each with a door opening directly onto a muddy, trash-strewn alley, looked less like a place of business and more like a row of holding pens at a slaughterhouse. The floor would be bare, rough planks, stained with decades of spilled liquor, tobacco spit, and God only knows what other bodily effluvia. The cracks between the boards would be filled with dirt, grime, and the ghosts of 1,000 sordid transactions. There was no janitorial staff. Cleaning, when it happened at all, was a cursory swipe with a filthy rag and a bucket of grey water. The stench was a physical presence, a thick, gagging miasma that clung to everything. It was a complex and horrifying perfume. At the base was the ever-present smell of rot, damp wood, decaying food scraps tossed in a corner, the faint, sweet odor of sickness. Layered on top of that was the sharp, acrid smell of unwashed bodies, the stale sweat of fear and exertion. Attempting to mask this was the cloying, cheap perfume worn by the women, a floral lie that couldn't conceal the decay beneath. Add to that the heavy, greasy smell of the gaslight, the sharp tang of cheap whiskey, and the ever-present pall of cigar and cigarette smoke, and you have an atmosphere that was not just unpleasant but physically oppressive. It was air you could taste, air that coated your tongue and lungs with the flavor of desperation. The sounds were no better. The relentless tinny plinking of a badly tuned piano from a nearby saloon provided a constant, maddeningly cheerful soundtrack to the grim proceedings. This was punctuated by the creak and groan of the bed, the central altar of this sordid church, a sound so constant it became background noise. Shouts from the alley, the breaking of a bottle, a sudden muffled cry, these were the hymns of the crib. The light was a co-conspirator in the deceit. A single flickering gas lamp or a smoky kerosene lantern would cast long, dancing shadows, creating an illusion of mystery while conveniently hiding the full extent of the filth. It hid the stains on the sheets, the peeling paint, the grime caked in the corners of the room. It was a merciful gloom that prevented anyone from seeing the reality of their surroundings too clearly. And then there were the tools of the trade, which were less instruments of pleasure and more agents of decay. The bed itself was the centerpiece, a rickety iron frame, springs groaning in protest, topped with a thin, lumpy mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks. This wasn't a place of comfort, it was a functional piece of equipment, and it was almost certainly infested with bedbugs and fleas. The sheets, if they existed, were coarse, grey from countless washings in harsh lye soap, and rarely changed. Beside the bed, a single wooden crate might serve as a nightstand, holding the true implements of the profession. A basin of murky cold water for a semblance of hygiene, a bar of harsh soap, and most sinister of all, the tools for feminine hygiene, which the pimp, in his role as a twisted quartermaster, would often procure. This wasn't soap and water, this was a horrifying arsenal of chemical warfare waged on the female body. Douches made from carbolic acid, alum, or even bichloride of mercury, all designed to prevent disease and pregnancy, but which caused agonizing burns, internal damage, and slow poisoning. The makeup was another tool of this toxic trade. The desirable pale complexion was achieved with powders and creams laced with lead and arsenic, which, over time, would cause nerve damage, paralysis, and a slow, painful death. The pimp didn't care. A pale girl fetched a better price, and, over time, was a problem for another day. His personal tools were simpler, a heavy walking stick, not for support but for enforcement, a small, easily concealed knife, and his own fists. These were his instruments of management, his methods for ensuring compliance and collecting his earnings. This environment wasn't just a backdrop, it was a cage, and the pimp, for all his bluster, was a prisoner in it too. He breathed the same foul air, heard the same miserable sounds, and was surrounded by the same filth. His office was a physical manifestation of his soul, a dark, cramped and rotting space built on a foundation of human misery and destined for eventual collapse. The squalor reinforced the power dynamic perfectly. It screamed that the people within it were worthless, that their bodies were just another disposable commodity in a world overflowing with them. And the pimp, the self-styled king of this garbage heap, was just the man charged with sorting the trash. In this fetid kingdom of filth and fleeting flesh, the pimp postured as the ultimate authority, the king on his rickety throne. But this was the grandest illusion of all. He was a middle manager in the vast, brutal bureaucracy of vice, a man who wielded absolute power over the truly powerless, while simultaneously cowering before a dozen different masters. His authority was a fragile bubble maintained by violence and fear, perpetually at risk of being popped by a bigger, meaner player in the game. Let's be clear, his power over the women in his stable was terrifyingly real. It wasn't built on charm, loyalty, or any kind of twisted affection. It was forged from a trinity of crude but effective tools: debt, addiction, and the fist. The debt was a masterpiece of predatory accounting. From the moment a woman fell under his control, the meter was running. He charged her for the cot in the flea-bitten room, for the rancid food she ate, for the cheap, gaudy dress she wore to attract clients. He charged her for the watered-down whiskey he forced on her to numb her to the work, and then charged her again for the protection he offered from the very dangers he cultivated. These debts were recorded in a phantom ledger, constantly growing, deliberately incomprehensible, ensuring that her earnings never caught up. She was trapped in a state of permanent financial servitude, a peon in an economy of flesh. His second tool was addiction. If a woman wasn't already a drinker, he'd encourage it. If she sought escape in laudanum or the burgeoning promise of opium, he'd often become her supplier. An addicted woman was a compliant woman. Her need for the next drink or the next dose became another chain, one that bound her more tightly than any physical restraint. Her desperation for the substance that dulled her reality made her dependent on the very man who orchestrated her misery. And when debt and addiction weren't enough, there was always violence. This was the foundation upon which his entire authority rested. A slap for talking back, a beating for holding out a few coins, a brutal public punishment to make an example for the others. This violence wasn't just about punishment, it was about maintenance. It was a constant, low-level terror that kept the system running, a reminder that he was the immediate, tangible threat in a world full of them. His hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope. He would preach about business and loyalty, demanding every last cent from a night's work, while he was constantly skimming, lying, and stealing from them. He'd accuse them of being untrustworthy degenerates, while he himself was the embodiment of treachery. He saw himself as a shrewd businessman, a manager of assets, but in reality he was just a thug who had stumbled upon a business model that required no skill, no ingenuity, only a complete lack of empathy and a willingness to inflict pain. But here's the delicious dark irony. This king was a serf in a much larger feudal system. His little empire of 1 or 2 cribs was a vassal state that paid tribute to a whole host of higher powers. First and foremost was the saloon owner. The brothel was often located in a building owned by the saloon, and the pimp was little more than a tenant who was always behind on rent. The saloon owner controlled the flow of alcohol, the primary social lubricant and currency of the district. He could cut off the pimp's supply, raise the rent, or simply have him thrown out on the street. The pimp had to stay in the owner's good graces, laughing at his bad jokes, buying him drinks he couldn't afford, a fawning sycophant to a man with slightly more power. Then there was the law, or rather its local, corrupted incarnation. The cop on the beat wasn't there to stop the vice, he was there to get his cut. Every week the pimp had to make his payoff, a fine or donation, to the policeman's retirement fund. If the payment was late or light, he could expect a raid, a night in the drunk tank, or just a savage beating in an alleyway. The cop was his business partner, a silent, menacing shareholder who could liquidate the company at will. And beyond the local cop was a whole food chain of corruption, stretching up to the judges and city officials who took a larger slice of the pie to allow the red light districts to operate. The pimp was just the lowest level collector, shaking down the women to pay off the men who truly ran the town. And finally, there was the rival pimp. Territory was everything. The corner of an alley, the entrance to a popular saloon, these were valuable pieces of real estate. A stronger, more violent or better connected pimp could simply decide he wanted that territory. The ensuing conflict wouldn't be a corporate takeover. It would be a brawl with knives, clubs, and broken bottles. Our pimp lived in constant fear of this, his eyes always scanning the street for his competitors, knowing that his entire livelihood could be taken from him in a flurry of brutal, primitive violence. His power was a joke. It only existed in the cramped, stinking space of the crib, and only over those more broken than he was. The moment he stepped outside, he was a nobody, a minnow swimming in a shark tank, desperately trying to look like a barracuda. His life was a frantic, stressful performance, a constant act of appeasement to the real powers that be, all while projecting an aura of absolute control to the women he brutalized. He was a tyrant in a closet, a king of a garbage heap, and he knew, in the quiet, terrified moments of the night, that his reign could end at any second. To truly understand the sordid transactions of the 19th century brothel, we have to crawl inside the heads of the people involved. We have to wade through the thick, murky swamp of their psychological landscape, a bizarre and terrifying world shaped by profound religious guilt, rampant superstition, and a complete and utter ignorance of basic human biology. The pimp, the prostitute, the client, they weren't just bodies colliding in a filthy room. They were carriers of deeply ingrained, often contradictory, beliefs that framed every single moment of the encounter. For the women, religion was often a source of profound, inescapable torment. Many came from religious backgrounds, their minds filled from childhood with vivid imagery of hellfire and damnation. Every transaction was not just a violation of their body, but a mortal stain on their soul. They were living in a state of perpetual sin, a reality that could be numbed with alcohol or opium, but never truly erased. You can imagine a woman, in the moments after a client has left, clutching a small, worn cross hidden beneath her mattress, whispering a desperate, hopeless prayer for a salvation she feels she has forever forfeited. The hypocrisy of the society around them was a constant source of bitter irony. The very men who quoted scripture on Sunday and preached about the sanctity of the family were often the same men who lined up at the crib door on a Saturday night. This didn't lessen the woman's sense of sin. It only deepened her sense of isolation and disgust with the world. For the pimp, religion was more of a tool and a nuisance. He was often aggressively atheistic, or at least performed a cynical disbelief. He saw the church as a rival business, one that peddled a different kind of fantasy, and, more importantly, one that threatened his income through reform movements and moral crusades. He'd mock the women's faith, calling it a weakness, another thing to be exploited. And yet, for all his bluster, he was often riddled with a primitive, gut-level superstition that was its own kind of twisted faith. He might not believe in God, but he absolutely believed in bad luck. He lived in a world governed by omens and portents. Spilling salt could ruin a night's take. A black cat crossing his path was a catastrophe. He might have a lucky coin he refused to spend, or a specific ritual he had to perform before the night began, a certain way of knotting his tie, a shot of whiskey from a particular glass, believing that to deviate from it would invite disaster. He was terrified of curses. A woman he had beaten or cheated might mutter something under her breath as he walked away, and the fear of that hex taking root would gnaw at him for days. He was a man who scoffed at the heavens but was terrified of whispers in the dark. Then there was the realm of folk medicine, a horrifying landscape of wives' tales and quackery that governed their understanding of the body. The germ theory of disease was new, esoteric knowledge, far from the minds of the people in the slums. They believed in miasmas, or bad air, as the cause of sickness. They believed diseases like syphilis were a kind of divine punishment for sin, a physical manifestation of moral rot. This meant that trying to prevent it was seen as defying God's will. The cures were even more terrifying than the diseases. They would drink foul-smelling herbal concoctions, apply poultices of dubious ingredients, or, most commonly, place their faith in the patent medicines sold by traveling charlatans. These potions were often little more than alcohol, opium, and laxatives, offering temporary relief while the disease ravaged them from within. Beliefs about conception were equally bizarre. A woman had to enjoy the act to conceive, some believed, or perhaps a certain position was required. These myths offered a fragile, false sense of control in a world where an unwanted pregnancy meant ruin, abandonment, and often a dangerous back-alley abortion. And beneath all this was the bedrock of psychological justification, the stories they told themselves to survive the night. The client, the John, had his own set of rationalizations. For the cowboy or miner, it was a biological necessity, a pressure valve for the lonely, brutal reality of his life. He earned this release through his hard, dangerous labor. For the married city gentleman, it was a necessary separation of spheres. Love and family existed in one world, and the purely physical, unclean act existed in another. He wasn't betraying his wife, he was protecting her from the sordidness of his own animal nature. The woman's justification was one of grim, professional detachment. This is just a job. It's not me, it's just my body. She would mentally check out, her mind floating away from the grimy room, focusing on a memory, a song, anything to create a distance between her consciousness and the physical act being performed on her. It was a vital survival mechanism, a way to preserve a tiny, untouched corner of her own soul. And the pimp? His internal monologue was a cesspool of self-pity and entitlement. "I'm a businessman," he'd tell himself, "providing a necessary service. These women would be dead in a ditch without my protection." He saw himself not as an exploiter, but as a misunderstood entrepreneur, a rugged individualist carving out a living in a harsh world. He framed his violence as discipline, his theft as management fees, and his cruelty as tough love. He was the hero of his own sordid story, a man constantly beset by ungrateful employees, treacherous rivals, and a judgmental society that just didn't understand the pressures he was under. These internal worlds, thick with fear, faith, ignorance, and delusion, were the invisible engine of the entire enterprise. The physical act was just the endpoint of a collision of these deeply held, often terrifying, belief systems. The transaction wasn't just about money for sex. It was about navigating a minefield of sin, sickness, and superstition, where every participant was telling themselves a desperate story just to make it to the morning. The night begins, not with a seductive glance or a whispered invitation, but with a jolt of raw, chaotic reality. This is the moment the fragile ecosystem of the brothel is shattered by the intrusion of the outside world. This is the first point of contact, and it's almost never smooth. It's here that the pimp's fantasy of being a suave, detached manager evaporates in a cloud of cheap whiskey and desperation. All his posturing, his careful construction of a tough guy persona is put to the test, and the results are rarely heroic. Imagine the scene. Our pimp is lurking in the shadows of the hallway or near the saloon door, his eyes scanning the crowd. He's not a host welcoming guests. He's a predator trying to spot the weakest prey. He's looking for the man who is just drunk enough to be reckless with his money, but not so drunk as to be violent and uncontrollable. It's a delicate, stressful calculation. A potential client stumbles over, a miner fresh from the diggings, his pockets full of a month's pay and his head full of loneliness and liquor. The transaction begins. The pimp names a price, probably double what he expects to get. The haggling is coarse, blunt, and devoid of any charm. This isn't a negotiation, it's a test of wills. And this is where the initial shock often occurs. The client, feeling bold from the booze, might shove the pimp. "That's robbery!" he might slur, his voice rising. Suddenly, the quiet, controlled environment the pimp tries to maintain is shattered. The other men at the bar turn to look. The women in the cribs fall silent, listening. This is the first critical test of the pimp's authority. He can't back down. That would be a sign of weakness that his rivals and even his own women would seize upon. He can't immediately resort to extreme violence. That might scare off other paying customers. He has to manage the situation, but he's not a trained diplomat. He's a thug, and his tools are intimidation and brute force. So he shoves back. His voice drops into a low growl, a string of profanities and threats. He might flash the handle of a knife tucked in his belt, or gesture to a larger, meaner-looking friend lounging nearby. The air crackles with the potential for sudden, ugly violence. The client, faced with this, either backs down, sullenly handing over the money, or he calls the pimp's bluff. If he calls the bluff, all hell breaks loose. The initial shock is the explosion of a clumsy, pathetic brawl. This is not a choreographed Hollywood fight scene. It's a graceless, desperate scuffle in a cramped, dirty space. Fists fly, but they're wild, drunken swings. Men trip over furniture, crash into the flimsy walls. A bottle gets broken, its jagged edge becoming a potential weapon. The pimp, for all his tough talk, is probably just as scared as the client. He's fighting not just for his fee, but for his reputation, his very survival in this brutal pecking order. He might land a lucky punch and send the man sprawling, or he might take a fist to the face, his nose exploding in a spray of blood. The illusion of the untouchable boss is instantly shattered. He's just another brawler, bleeding and sweating in the dirt. Or consider another scenario for this initial shock. The client is amenable, the price is agreed upon, and he disappears into the crib with one of the women. The pimp breathes a sigh of relief, pockets the money, and goes back to his lurid vigil. A few minutes later, a scream erupts from the room. Not a scream of passion, but one of terror or pain. The pimp's blood runs cold. What now? Is the client a sadist? Is the woman having a medical emergency? Has she tried to rob the client? He has to intervene. He bursts into the room, his mind racing through the disastrous possibilities. Perhaps the client is having a heart attack, or maybe the woman, in a desperate act of defiance, has pulled a knife. The pimp is now a crisis manager, and he has no training, no resources, and no good options. If the client is dead or injured, he has a body to dispose of. If the woman is hurt, his asset is damaged. If she has fought back, she has broken the cardinal rule of the business, and he has to punish her, but not so badly that she can't work. The initial shock is the moment the theoretical business of selling sex collides with the messy, unpredictable, and often violent reality of human beings. It's the client who refuses to pay. It's the woman who suddenly breaks down, her professional detachment cracking under the strain. It's the sudden, unwelcome appearance of a police officer who hasn't been paid off, his face a mask of righteous indignation that can only be erased with a wad of cash the pimp doesn't have. Every one of these moments is a shock to his system, a brutal reminder that he is not in control. He is a man perpetually reacting to chaos, trying to plug leaks in a dam that is always on the verge of bursting. His entire enterprise is a house of cards built over a sinkhole, and the first gust of wind, the first tremor of genuine trouble, sends him scrambling in a desperate, undignified panic. The night has just begun, and already his crown is askew and his throne is shaking. Once the initial chaos of the first transaction subsides, the night settles into its true rhythm. And that rhythm is not one of excitement or glamour. It's a grinding, soul-crushing slog. This is the midpoint of the sordid journey, a long, repetitive stretch of time where the full weight of the filth, the noise, and the sheer human misery of the enterprise becomes almost unbearable. The pimp, our supposed captain of industry, is not celebrating his success. He is enduring a slow-motion nightmare, a marathon of boredom punctuated by moments of grotesque horror. His post is a purgatory. He might stand for hours in a smoky, narrow hallway, leaning against a wall sticky with grime, or sit on a hard stool just inside the saloon doors. His job is to watch, to wait, to listen. He becomes a connoisseur of the sounds of his trade, and they are not erotic. He hears the constant, rhythmic creaking of the cheap iron bed frames from the cribs, a sound that becomes as monotonous and maddening as a dripping faucet. He hears the muffled grunts, the forced moans, the occasional sharp slap of flesh on flesh. He hears the low, rumbling negotiations, the slurred whispers, the strained attempts at pillow talk. These are not the sounds of passion. They are the sounds of labor, the mechanical noises of a human factory floor. The air itself is an assault. The initial stench of stale booze, sweat, and cheap perfume doesn't dissipate, it intensifies. As the night wears on and more bodies crowd into the small space, the oxygen seems to thin, replaced by a thick, warm fug of human expiration. New smells join the chorus, the metallic tang of blood from a bar fight, the sour scent of vomit from a client who couldn't handle his liquor, the faint, sickeningly sweet smell of laudanum on a woman's breath. The pimp breathes this in for hours on end, his lungs coated in the residue of his business. This is the air he lives on. Then there are the close-up, anatomical details he is forced to confront. He's the one who has to handle the money, which is often damp with sweat, sticky with spilled beer, and passed directly from the hand of a man who has just been engaged in the most intimate of acts. He has to look at the clients, really look at them, and see the reality that the dim light tries to hide. He sees the sores on their lips, the track marks on their arms, the haunted, empty look in their eyes. He sees the physical toll the life is taking on the women, the pallor of their skin under the cheap makeup, the slight tremor in their hands, the way their smiles never quite reach their eyes. He is the curator of a museum of human decay, and he is a resident exhibit. The grinding chaos is not just sensory, it's logistical. He is the bouncer, the cashier, and the clock watcher. He has to keep track of who is in which room, for how long. He has to make sure the client doesn't overstay his welcome, a task that often involves an awkward, tense confrontation at the door. "Time's up, friend." This simple phrase can easily escalate into another argument, another potential brawl. He has to be the one to deal with the messes, both literal and figurative. When a client gets sick and vomits in the hallway, it's the pimp, or one of the women under his angry command, who has to clean it up with a bucket of dirty water. When a fight leaves a smear of blood on the wall, he's the one who has to wipe it away before it scares off the next customer. He is the janitor of his own personal hell. There are moments of pure, surreal horror. A client might emerge from a room, not satisfied, but weeping, overcome by a sudden wave of guilt or loneliness. The pimp has no script for this. He can only shove the man out the door, disgusted by the display of unmanly emotion. Or a woman might have a seizure, a reaction to disease, or the toxic patent medicines she's taking. The pimp is not a doctor. He can only watch in a mixture of terror and fury, his primary concern not for her health, but for the loss of income and the potential trouble a dead body would cause. The slog is also financial. He's counting his money, but it's never enough. He's constantly doing the grim arithmetic in his head. This much for the rent, this much for the whiskey, this much for the cop's payoff. He sees the cash coming in, but it flows through his hands like water, disappearing into the pockets of his many masters. The small hoard of coins in his pocket feels less like wealth and more like a temporary reprieve from total destitution. This midpoint is where the romantic myth of the pimp truly dies. He is not living a life of leisure, profiting from a distance. He is mired in the absolute worst of it, a prisoner of the very system he helps perpetuate. The women may be performing the physical labor, but he is forced to bear witness, to manage the ugliest details, to breathe in the failure and the filth. The The chaos isn't exciting, it's exhausting. The repetition isn't profitable, it's soul-destroying. He is on a treadmill of grime and degradation, running as fast as he can just to stay in the same disgusting place. The night is long and the dawn is a long, long way off. No matter how carefully our pimp tries to manage his sordid little enterprise, failure is not a possibility, it's an inevitability. The entire structure of his life is a tower of rotting wood, and it's destined to collapse. The downfall is rarely a single, dramatic event. It's more often a slow, humiliating slide into ruin, an anticlimactic decay that punctures any last shred of his self-styled heroism. The end for a 19th century pimp was never glorious. It was pathetic, squalid, and usually solitary. One of the most common paths to ruin was his own financial incompetence. The pimp, despite seeing himself as a businessman, was almost always terrible with money. The cash that flowed into his hands was treated not as capital to be invested, but as a fleeting prize to be immediately consumed. Any small windfall would be squandered on flashy, cheap clothes meant to project an image of success he hadn't earned. He'd buy a new waistcoat or a gaudy ring, believing the appearance of wealth would somehow magically create it. His other major financial leak was the gambling table. The same desperate, risk-taking mentality that led him to his profession made him a perfect mark for the card sharps and crooked faro dealers who populated the saloons. He'd take a good night's earnings and lose it all on the turn of a single card, convinced he was just one lucky hand away from a real fortune. He'd stumble out into the pre-dawn light, his pockets empty, filled with a toxic mix of self-loathing and fury, which he would inevitably take out on the women who had earned the money in the first place. This financial instability meant he was always on a knife's edge, one bad night away from being unable to pay his rent or his protection money, the two pillars holding up his world. But a far more insidious and surefire downfall came from within his own body. In an age before antibiotics, in a profession that was a veritable petri dish of infection, contracting a venereal disease was not a risk, it was a certainty. And for the pimp, it was the ultimate, horrifying irony. He, who treated the women's bodies as mere commodities to be inspected for signs of disease, would eventually find the rot blossoming in his own flesh. The initial symptoms of gonorrhea, the burning, the discharge, were a source of terror and shame. He would try to hide it, convinced it was a temporary ailment he could sweat out with whiskey. He'd seek out back-alley quacks who would sell him useless, often poisonous, cures. But it was syphilis, the great pox, that was the true death sentence. The initial chancre might be ignored or mistaken for a simple sore, but then came the secondary stage, the rashes, the fevers, the hair loss, the lesions in the mouth and throat. His carefully constructed facade of the tough, healthy male would begin to crumble. He couldn't hide the signs of sickness forever. Clients would start to avoid his establishment, fearing contagion. The women would look at him with a mixture of fear and a certain grim satisfaction. The final tertiary stage of syphilis was a living nightmare. The disease would attack his nervous system, leading to madness, paralysis, and dementia. It would eat away at his bones, causing his nose to collapse, the telltale saddle nose that was a walking advertisement of his condition. The pimp, who had built his identity on physical intimidation and a crude sort of charm, would be reduced to a shuffling, disfigured, babbling wreck. His downfall wasn't a shootout, it was the slow, inexorable decay of his own cells, a biological consequence of the life he had chosen. Then, of course, there was the ever-present threat of violence. His entire career was a series of provocations. He cheated clients, beat women, and feuded with rivals. It was only a matter of time before he picked a fight with the wrong man. It might be a client who was bigger, stronger, or simply more desperate than he was. It could be a rival pimp who decided to eliminate the competition permanently. Or it could be the brother or father of a woman he had abused, seeking righteous, brutal vengeance. His end would be swift and undignified. A knife in the ribs in a dark alley, a bullet in the back, or a savage beating that left him crippled or dead in the gutter. There would be no dramatic last words, no heroic final stand, just a messy, anonymous death, his body to be discovered hours later, his pockets already turned out by scavengers. The ultimate humiliation was to survive, but to be broken. A bad beating could leave him with a permanent limp, a missing eye, or scrambled wits. He could no longer enforce his will through violence, and without that he had nothing. His women would abandon him, his rivals would mock him, and he would be cast out, a pathetic shell of his former self, forced to beg for scraps in the very saloons where he once played the king. The downfall of the pimp was the universe balancing its books. He who lived by exploiting the physical weakness of others would be brought down by the failure of his own body. He who lived by violence would be destroyed by greater violence. And he who built a fantasy of wealth on the backs of others would die penniless and alone. It was never a tragedy. It was a grim, predictable, and in a way, just conclusion. The narrative of the pimp as an all-powerful puppet master conveniently erases the agency, however limited, of the women he exploited. He was not managing a stable of docile, broken animals. He was dealing with human beings who, even in the most desperate circumstances, found ways to resist, to fight back, and to make his life a living hell. These small, often futile acts of defiance were a constant source of stress and paranoia for him, a relentless chipping away at his fragile authority. The power reversals, though fleeting, were a critical part of his miserable existence, reminding him daily that his control was an illusion he had to perpetually fight to maintain. The most common form of resistance was subtle, a silent war of attrition fought on the economic front. The women were experts at hiding money. They knew he would take every cent they earned, so they developed ingenious ways to hold back a portion for themselves. A coin could be slipped into the hem of a dress, tucked into a crack in the floorboards, or hidden in a small pouch tied to their leg. This wasn't just about saving for an escape. It was an act of self-preservation and dignity. Every stolen dollar was a small victory, a declaration that some part of their labor belonged to them. The pimp, consumed by paranoia, knew this was happening. It drove him mad. He would conduct surprise searches, tear apart their meager belongings, and deliver beatings on mere suspicion. But he could never be sure he'd found it all. This constant, nagging belief that he was being cheated, that his employees were secretly laughing at him, was a corrosive acid on his soul. Another powerful tool of resistance was sabotage. A woman who particularly hated her pimp or a specific, abusive client could deliberately provide a terrible experience. She could be cold, clumsy, or feign sickness. She could accidentally spill a drink on a wealthy client's expensive suit. She could start an argument or feign hysterics. The goal was to damage the pimp's business, to ruin his reputation. A few disgruntled clients spreading the word that his establishment was no good could seriously impact his bottom line. This was a dangerous game for the woman. She risked a savage beating if caught, but for some, the satisfaction of costing him money was worth the risk. It was a way of fighting back with the only weapon she had, her performance. Then there was the camaraderie of the oppressed. In the quiet moments, away from the pimp's watchful eyes, the women would share information. They would warn each other about dangerous clients, share remedies for ailments, and offer what little comfort they could. Sometimes this solidarity would manifest as collective action. They might all feign sickness on a busy night, or work together to hide a larger sum of money. These moments of shared defiance were a direct threat to his divide-and-conquer strategy. He tried to keep them isolated and pitted against each other, competing for his favor. When they united, even for a moment, his power was fundamentally challenged. The ultimate act of resistance, of course, was the escape attempt. This was the pimp's greatest fear. A woman, especially one who was young, popular, and a good earner, was his most valuable asset. Her disappearance was a catastrophic financial blow. She might run off with a client who had promised her a better life, a promise that was usually a lie, but a chance worth taking. She might save up enough stolen coins to simply buy a ticket on a train and disappear into the vastness of the country. The pimp's reaction would be frantic. He would hunt for her, his rage fueled by the public humiliation and the loss of income. He'd storm through saloons and flop houses, asking questions, making threats. But the country was large, and a woman who truly wanted to vanish often could. His failure to find her was a public declaration of his impotence, a signal to his rivals that his property wasn't secure. And sometimes the cracks in the system appeared from the other side. A client, perhaps a young man new to the city, might be so horrified by the reality of the crib, the filth, the woman's obvious despair, that he would refuse to go through with it. He might even try to save her, offering her money to escape. This was a direct challenge to the pimp's entire worldview. He couldn't comprehend such a sentiment. He would see it as an insult, an act of a coward, and would likely react with violence, beating the would-be savior and reinforcing his brutal control over the woman. These moments of resistance, these failed escapes and emotional cracks were the fabric of the pimp's daily life. They demolished the myth of his easy, leisurely existence. He wasn't relaxing while his money rolled in. He was a frantic, paranoid prison warden, constantly checking the locks, quelling small riots, and terrified of a mass breakout. Every day was a battle to maintain order in a system that was inherently unstable, and every act of defiance was a reminder that the people he treated as objects were, in fact, human, and that humanity could be a very dangerous and unpredictable thing. Just when the grinding, predictable misery of the pimp's life seemed to have settled into a stable rhythm of filth and fear, a wild card element would inevitably be dealt from the bottom of the deck. History, with its sick sense of humor, always has another layer of horror to add. This was the escalation, the complicating factor that would arrive without warning and turn his already precarious existence into a full-blown catastrophe. The pimp's world was a fragile ecosystem, and it didn't take much to throw it into total chaos, making everything weirder, more intense, and infinitely worse. One of the most dreaded wildcards was the arrival of the reformers. Imagine our pimp nursing a whiskey and surveying his domain when a new sound cuts through the usual din of the saloon, singing. Not the usual drunken bawling, but the earnest, off-key sound of hymns. He peers out the door, and his blood runs cold. It's a group of them. Women, mostly, dressed in severe black, their faces pinched with righteous fury. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union or a similar social purity league, armed with Bibles and banners denouncing the devil's workshop. They wouldn't just protest, they would engage. They'd stand outside the brothel, their hymns a direct sonic assault on the business of sin. They would try to block clients from entering, shaming them with loud accusations and prayers for their damned souls. They'd call out the pimp by name, branding him a ghoul and a white slaver, his carefully constructed anonymity shattered in a torrent of public condemnation. For the pimp, this was a nightmare. It was terrible for business, scaring off even the most hardened clients who didn't want their vice accompanied by a sermon. It also drew the unwanted attention of the law. The cops who were happy to take his bribe money might be forced to stage a clean-up raid to appease the powerful church-going folk. The reformers were a force he couldn't intimidate with his usual thuggery. They were immune to his threats, fueled by a divine certainty that made them fearless. He could only watch, seething with impotent rage, as they dismantled his business one hymn at a time. Another, more terrifying wildcard was a sudden outbreak of disease. Not the slow burn of syphilis, but the galloping terror of a true epidemic. Cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, these plagues swept through the crowded, unsanitary slums of 19th century cities like fire through dry grass. For the pimp, this was an apocalyptic event. The red light district, with its transient population and lack of sanitation, would become the epicenter of the outbreak. Business would evaporate overnight. No one would risk death for a few moments of pleasure. The saloons would empty, the streets would fall silent, and a quarantine might be enforced, trapping him inside the plague pit. His assets would become his greatest liability. The women living in close quarters would fall sick, one by one. Their bodies, already weakened by malnutrition, alcohol, and other diseases, would be fertile ground for the epidemic. He would be trapped in his flophouse, surrounded by the sights and sounds of agonizing death. He couldn't call a doctor, that would bring the authorities. He couldn't abandon them, he was trapped too. His empire would transform into a makeshift, horrifying hospice, with him as the unwilling and terrified nursemaid. The smell of sickness and death would replace the smell of perfume and whiskey. His income would be zero, and his own life would be in mortal danger with every breath he took. His world wouldn't just collapse, it would liquefy into a soup of pestilence and terror. A more personal, and perhaps even more frightening wildcard was the arrival of a man with a mission. Not a reformer, but someone with a personal stake. Imagine a wealthy, influential father from back east, whose runaway daughter, seduced by a fantasy of city life, has ended up in our pimp's clutches. This father wouldn't send the local police, he would hire the Pinkertons. Suddenly, the pimp isn't dealing with a corrupt, lazy beat cop. He's being hunted by relentless professional detectives who can't be bought off or intimidated. These agents would descend on the district, discreetly asking questions, spreading money around, and piecing together the trail. The pimp's usual network of informants and lookouts would be useless against them. He would start to feel a new kind of paranoia, the sense of being watched by unseen, competent eyes. The Pinkertons wouldn't just rescue the girl, their mission would be to destroy the man who ruined her. They would dig into his past, expose his rackets to the non-corrupt elements of the law, and ensure he was utterly crushed. For the pimp, this was like a hawk appearing in a chicken coop. He was out of his league, a small-time predator suddenly finding himself the prey of a far more sophisticated and lethal hunter. This escalation, whatever its form, served to expose the pimp's utter lack of real power. He could handle the daily grind of his sordid world, but he was completely unprepared for any significant deviation from the norm. The arrival of the unexpected, be it religious zeal, biological plague, or professional justice, would shatter his fragile reality, revealing him for what he truly was, a bottom feeder, helpless and terrified when the tide of real power turned against him. His kingdom was built on sand, and these wild cards were the inevitable flood. The party is over, the last client has stumbled away, the last bottle is empty, or the last raid has swept through. What's left is the aftermath, the immediate fallout. This is not a scene of quiet contemplation. It is a landscape of grotesque exhaustion, a hollowed-out moment where the full, ugly cost of the night's business comes due. The tone is not one of relief, but of depleted, nerve-jangling weariness. The main event has ended, and now the grim, silent work of clean-up and damage assessment begins. Picture the scene in the cold, grey light of dawn, which seeps through the grimy windows like a judgment. The air, if possible, is even more foul than it was at the height of the chaos. The lingering smells of sweat, sex, and cheap perfume now mingle with the stale, dead scent of cigar butts and spilled liquor. The flickering gaslight has been extinguished, and the unforgiving morning light reveals the true extent of the squalor. It illuminates every stain on the floorboards, every smear on the wall, every speck of filth that the merciful darkness had concealed. The room looks like a battlefield after a pathetic, meaningless skirmish. An overturned chair lies on its side. A broken glass glitters in a pool of sticky liquid on the floor. The bed is a wreck, the thin sheets twisted and stained, the lumpy mattress looking like a relief map of misery. This is the pimp's kingdom in the morning light, a cheap, trashed, and profoundly sad little space. The bodies in this landscape are not objects of desire, they are vessels of pure exhaustion. The woman lies on the bed, not in a seductive pose, but in a heap of boneless depletion. Her makeup is smeared, creating a clownish mask of tragedy. Her hair is matted, her eyes are closed, but she isn't sleeping peacefully. It's the sleep of the utterly spent, a shallow, temporary escape. Her breathing is shallow, perhaps punctuated by a low, rattling cough. She is a machine that has been run too hard and is now powered down, waiting for the inevitable moment when she will be switched back on. The pimp himself is a portrait of defeated squalor. He's slumped in his chair, his cheap, flashy clothes now looking rumpled and stained. His face is pale and puffy, his eyes bloodshot. He's not counting a great victory's spoils. He's engaged in the grim triage of his meager earnings. He empties his pockets onto a sticky table, and the coins and crumpled bills are a pathetic sight. He separates them into piles, this for the rent, this for the booze, this for the payoff to the cop. There is never a pile for profit or savings. It's all just covering debts, plugging holes, and ensuring he can survive to do it all again tomorrow. The process is one of grim necessity, not joyful accounting. There might be a moment of looting. If a client left something behind, a handkerchief, a cheap pocket knife, it's immediately claimed. Nothing of value is ever overlooked. The pimp might even go through the pockets of a woman while she sleeps, a final petty act of theft to ensure he hasn't been cheated. This is the level of his business acumen, the scavenging of scraps. If the aftermath is the result of a raid or a major fight, the scene is even more desolate. The authorities have come and gone, leaving a trail of destruction. Furniture is smashed, doors are kicked off their hinges. The women have been hauled off to the drunk tank, where they will be fined, money the pimp will have to pay, adding it to their debt, and released back into his custody, more broken than before. The pimp, if he wasn't arrested himself, is left to survey the wreckage. He is not a general planning his next campaign. He is a man whose hovel has just been ransacked. He has to assess the damage, figure out how much it will cost to make the place barely functional again, and curse his luck. This is the hollow core of his existence. The night, with all its noise, violence, and frantic energy, was a distraction. The aftermath is the silent, brutal truth. There is no glory here, no power, no wealth. There is only a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and the quiet, gnawing understanding that this entire cycle of filth and desperation will begin again in just a few short hours. The cleanup is both literal and metaphorical. He might have to physically clean up a mess, vomit, blood, or worse, a task he performs with a sullen, resentful fury. But he's also trying to clean up his own shattered nerves, to push down the fear and the self-loathing with a morning shot of whiskey. He's trying to restore a semblance of order to a life that is fundamentally chaotic. The aftermath is the pimp at his most honest, even if he'd never admit it. He is a janitor, a bookkeeper for petty cash, and a damage assessor in a failing, disgusting business. The sun is up, and it has illuminated the full, pathetic scope of his failure. The immediate, physical fallout of the night is grotesque, but it's the lingering, invisible wounds that truly define the pimp's existence. The cuts and bruises from a brawl will heal, but the psychological scars, the deep-seated trauma of his chosen life, will fester and rot his soul from the inside out. He is not a man who processes his experiences. He is a man who is perpetually haunted by them, and his coping mechanisms are as pathetic and destructive as the life he leads. The primary psychological state of the washed-up, or even the currently operating pimp, is a thick, suffocating blanket of paranoia. He trusts no one. Absolutely no one. Every person he sees is a potential threat. Every client is a potential undercover cop or a robber. Every woman in his stable is a potential thief or informant. Every rival on the street is a potential murderer. He lives in a state of constant, high-alert vigilance that is utterly exhausting. He can't relax. He can't sleep soundly. He starts at sudden noises. He scans every face in a crowd, looking for signs of treachery. This isn't a rational assessment of risk. It's a full-blown persecution complex, a mental prison of his own making. He is haunted by the ghosts of his own actions, the faces of the women he has beaten, the men he has cheated, the violence he has witnessed. These things don't just disappear with the morning light. They become part of his internal landscape. He might suffer from nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, the memory of a scream or the sight of blood still vivid in his mind. During the day, he's plagued by intrusive thoughts, flashbacks to moments of brutality that he tries to push away with a drink. He has seen the absolute worst of human nature, and he has been an active participant in it. That knowledge curdles inside him, turning into a deep-seated cynicism that poisons every interaction. He believes everyone is as corrupt and selfish as he is, which only serves to deepen his isolation. To cope with this unrelenting psychological pressure, his primary tool is emotional numbness. He has to cauterize his own empathy to survive. He builds a thick wall of callus around his heart, refusing to feel anything, not pity, not guilt, not love. Any flicker of genuine human connection is seen as a weakness, a chink in his armor that could be exploited. This detachment is a survival mechanism, but it leaves him a hollowed-out shell of a man. He goes through the motions of life, but he feels nothing. His laughter is hollow, his anger is a performance, and his moments of pleasure are fleeting and empty. He is a spectator in his own life, watching his own actions with a kind of grim, dispassionate interest. His most reliable coping mechanism, of course, is substance abuse. Alcohol is his constant companion, the fuel that gets him through the day, and the anesthetic that numbs him at night. He drinks to summon the courage to be violent, and he drinks to forget the violence he has committed. It's a vicious, self-destructive cycle. Many pimps also fall into the clutches of opium or laudanum, seeking a more profound escape from their miserable reality. The dreamy state of the opium den is a perfect antidote to the harsh, ugly world he inhabits. But this escape comes at a cost. Addiction tightens its grip, destroying his health, draining his finances, and making him even more paranoid and desperate. He becomes a slave to the very substances he once used to control others. Dark humor becomes another twisted coping tool. He and his fellow bottom feeders might joke about the clap, about a client's weird fetish, or about a near miss with the law. This isn't joyful humor, it's the gallows humor of the damned. It's a way of taking the horrific, unspeakable realities of their lives and trying to shrink them down to a manageable size, to turn a tragedy into a punchline. By laughing at the abyss, they try to convince themselves they are not falling into it. But it's a thin defense, and it always fails in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. As he gets older and his physical presence wanes, the trauma manifests as a profound, bitter resentment. He is consumed by a sense of grievance against the world. He feels he has been cheated, that he never got his due. He rages against the women who betrayed him, the rivals who bested him, the society that scorned him. He never, ever accepts his own role in his downfall. He is the eternal victim of his own story, a tragic hero brought low by a cruel and unjust world. This narrative is the last pathetic line of defense for his shattered ego. The pimp's end-of-life psychological profile is a grim one, a paranoid, emotionally numb, substance-abusing wreck, consumed by bitterness and haunted by the ghosts of his past. The swaggering Mac of his youth has been completely eroded, leaving behind only a terrified, broken old man trapped in a prison of his own traumatic memories, waiting for an end that cannot come soon enough. When we zoom out from the pathetic, self-contained tragedy of the individual pimp, we begin to see the foul, greasy stain his profession left on the fabric of 19th century society. He wasn't just a personal menace. He and his kind were a collective plague, a parasitic class that actively contributed to public health crises, economic stagnation, and a deepening cycle of social decay. Their cumulative impact was far more destructive than their individual sordid lives might suggest. The most immediate and devastating societal ripple effect was on public health. The pimp's business model was a super-spreader event for venereal disease. In a world without effective treatment, syphilis and gonorrhea were not mere inconveniences. They were life-altering, often fatal plagues. The pimp, in his relentless pursuit of profit, actively fought against any and all attempts at hygiene or regulation that might slow down business. A sick woman was a non-earning asset, so his solution was not to seek proper medical care, but to hide the sickness for as long as possible, forcing her to continue working and infecting countless clients. These clients would then carry the disease home to their wives, leading to a devastating cascade of infection, sterility, and congenital syphilis in newborns. The pimp was a key vector in this chain of misery. He was the typhoid Mary of the clap. When cures were sought, they were in the hands of quack doctors who prescribed mercury and arsenic, treatments that often caused more damage than the disease itself. The pimp, a believer in quick fixes and cheap solutions, was a prime customer for these charlatans, further poisoning himself and his women. The red light districts he helped manage became reservoirs of pestilence, radiating disease out into the wider community and placing an immense, unspoken burden on the primitive public health systems of the time. The economic impact was equally corrosive. The pimp was a black hole for capital. He produced nothing, built nothing, and invested nothing. He was a pure parasite, siphoning wages from the productive sectors of the economy, miners, soldiers, laborers, farmers, and squandering it on consumption and vice. The money a cowboy spent in a brothel was money that didn't go to a general store, a blacksmith, or a savings account. The pimp's entire business was based on creating and servicing addiction to alcohol, to gambling, to opium, which further drained the economic vitality of a town. He was a central figure in a shadow economy built on debt peonage and human misery. This underground economy was also deeply intertwined with political corruption. The bribe money the pimp paid to the beat cop was just the first step in a long ladder of graft that often reached the highest levels of municipal government. The existence of a thriving vice district was a sign of a rotten city administration, one that preferred to profit from human misery rather than govern effectively. The pimp, in his small, pathetic way, was a key functionary in this system of official corruption, helping to normalize and perpetuate a culture of bribery and lawlessness. The societal response to the pimp was, ironically, often as damaging as the problem itself. He became a convenient boogeyman, the public face of urban decay and moral rot. This led to periodic and often hysterical social crusades. Reformers, genuinely horrified by the white slave trade, pushed for sweeping legislation. The most famous of these, the Mann Act in the United States, was ostensibly designed to prosecute pimps for transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. In reality, these laws were often used as tools to police women's sexuality, to punish interracial relationships, and to control female mobility. The figure of the evil pimp became a justification for a broader social crackdown that often harmed the very women it was supposed to protect. The pimp didn't create the societal demand for prostitution, but he perfected a particularly predatory and destructive model for servicing it. Finally, there was the question of the next generation. What happened to the children born from these sordid encounters? Their fate was almost universally tragic. Often abandoned by their mothers who were unable to care for them, they ended up in underfunded, brutal orphanages or were simply left to fend for themselves on the streets. They grew up bearing the immense stigma of their birth, marked as the offspring of sin. For the boys, a life of petty crime was a common path. For the girls, the risk of being drawn into the same cycle of exploitation as their mothers was terrifyingly high. The pimp created no family, no positive legacy. His only contribution to the future was a new generation of traumatized, marginalized individuals, a living ripple effect of his destructive and utterly parasitic life. He was a societal dead end, a human pothole on the road of progress. After all the filth, the disease, and the pathetic, grinding misery comes the most bizarre and infuriating chapter of all, the rewriting of history. The bitter legacy of the 19th century pimp is not the story of a desperate syphilitic parasite. It's the story of a cynical, collective act of cultural amnesia, a deliberate choice to swap a disgusting reality for a romantic, alluring myth. We, as a society, took the portrait of a flea-bitten thug and hung it in a gilded frame, calling it art. This transformation is a masterclass in historical laundering, a process of taking the blood and pus-stained rags of the past and bleaching them into the crisp white linen of legend. How did this happen? How did the pimp, a figure of profound human failure, become an anti-hero? The process began with the pulp fiction of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Dime novels and sensationalist newspapers, hungry for lurid content, needed villains who were more than just pathetic losers. They needed charismatic figures of the underworld, men who lived by their own code, who were dangerous but also strangely compelling. The pimp was a perfect candidate for a makeover. They smoothed his rough edges, gave him a quick wit instead of a string of slurred profanities, and dressed him in a fine suit instead of cheap stained wool. They edited out the constant, gnawing paranoia and replaced it with a cool, calculating confidence. The terror of contracting syphilis was transformed into a devil-may-care attitude toward danger. His brutal exploitation of women was reframed as a complex, almost paternalistic relationship. He wasn't a monster, he was just misunderstood. Hollywood, in its insatiable hunger for archetypes, seized this fictionalized version and magnified it 1,000 times. The movie pimp became a staple, the suave, cynical businessman of sin, the gatekeeper to a world of forbidden pleasure. He was given a heart of gold, a secret soft spot for the fallen woman he was supposedly protecting. He was the one who would stand up to the truly evil gangster or the corrupt politician, a rogue element of honor in a dishonorable world. Think of the classic film noir or the gangster movie. The pimp is often a secondary character, but a memorable one. He's the source of information, the man with the connections, the purveyor of a certain kind of worldly, cynical wisdom. The filth of his real-life trade was airbrushed away. We never see him cleaning up vomit or frantically checking a woman for lice. We see him in a smoky nightclub, sipping whiskey, surrounded by beautiful women who seem to adore him, a picture of effortless control. Why did we embrace this lie so enthusiastically? The reasons are as cynical as the man himself. The myth is simply a more comfortable story to tell ourselves. It allows us to engage with the romance of the underworld without having to confront the disgusting reality of exploitation. It turns a story about human trafficking, disease, and abuse into a thrilling tale of adventure and roguish charm. It feeds into powerful cultural fantasies, particularly those surrounding masculine power. The mythical pimp is a fantasy of total control, control over women, over money, over his environment. He is beholden to no one, a master of his own destiny. This is a deeply appealing fantasy for a society that often makes individuals feel powerless. The lie also serves to erase the victims. In the romanticized version, the women are not desperate, trapped individuals. They are willing participants, bad girls who enjoy their lifestyle and are loyal to their protector. This absolves the viewer, and by extension society, of any complicity or guilt. We don't have to think about the real-world systems of poverty and misogyny that created the sex trade. We can just enjoy the story of the cool outlaw and his gang of merry hookers. The bitter legacy, then, is that the pimp's greatest con was not the one he pulled on the women he exploited, but the one he, or rather his ghost, pulled on future generations. We chose to remember the performance, not the man behind the curtain. We bought the flashy suit and ignored the syphilitic sores festering beneath it. We took a story of profound, pathetic failure and rewrote it as a legend of rebellious success. We traded the truth, a paranoid, terrified loser fighting over sticky pennies in a piss-stinking alley, for a fantasy of a velvet-clad king on a throne of sin. And that sanitization is perhaps the most disgusting part of his entire story. So we've dragged the 19th century pimp out of the romanticized shadows of dime novels and Hollywood backlots and into the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. We've seen that he wasn't a charismatic kingpin, but a pathetic, grimy, and predictable parasite. His life was not one of power and pleasure, but of paranoia, disease, and constant grinding fear. We have watched his entire sordid enterprise, from the humiliating morning inspections to the inevitable, lonely downfall. We have seen how history, in its infinite capacity for self-deception, laundered his story, transforming a tale of squalid exploitation into a myth of roguish anti-heroism. We traded the truth of a syphilitic loser for the fantasy of a velvet-clad king. But here is the final bleak punchline. The pimp is not dead. He didn't die in a gutter in the 1890s. He just changed his clothes, cleaned up his language, and went into business in the 21st century. The fundamental business model, the exploitation of desperation for profit under the guise of providing an opportunity, is alive and thriving. You just have to know where to look. Think about the modern gig economy platform that calls its workforce independent contractors to avoid providing benefits or a minimum wage. It sells a dream of freedom and being your own boss, all while controlling the flow of work, setting the rates, and taking a massive cut off the top. It creates a system of total dependence while cloaking itself in the language of empowerment. That platform, with its sleek app and its friendly user interface, is running the same hustle. It's just a digital pimp, and the debt is the algorithm that keeps the workers chasing the next low-paying gig. Consider the multi-level marketing scheme that recruits people, often vulnerable women, with promises of financial independence and a supportive community. It forces them to go into debt buying inventory they can't sell, all while the people at the top of the pyramid rake in the profits. They sell a fantasy of entrepreneurship, but the reality is a system of exploitation where the vast majority are doomed to fail, blaming themselves instead of the predatory structure. That's the pimp's pep talk, delivered with a smile and a hashtag. Look at the predatory landlord who owns a block of run-down apartments in a poor neighborhood. He charges exorbitant rent for squalid conditions, refuses to make repairs, and evicts families at the slightest provocation. He calls it providing housing, a simple business transaction. But he is profiting directly from the lack of options available to his tenants, leveraging their desperation to enrich himself. He's a slumlord, a modern pimp whose cribs are just a little bit bigger. The 19th century pimp wasn't a historical monster, an anomaly of a bygone era. He was a business model, a timeless and depressingly effective one. He is the living embodiment of an economic theory that states that the most efficient way to extract value is to find someone with nothing and then take half. The suit is nicer now, the violence is more likely to be economic than physical, and the diseases are more metaphorical than biological, but the core function is identical. It's about creating and maintaining a system of dependence and profiting from the misery it produces, all while telling a story about opportunity and freedom. So the next time you encounter a system that promises you liberation while holding all the keys, that calls you a partner, while treating you like a disposable cog, just remember the man in the cheap, louse-infested derby hat. The technology has changed, but the hustle remains eternal. The only real question left is, which character are you in his new, improved story?